On behalf of the Stanford Historical Society, my name is Jeff Brouws, and our town historian, Kathy Spears, is in the back room there. And we have periodic lectures from time to time. And so tonight we have our friend Jack Kelly. And let me tell you a little bit about Jack. He's a journalist and a novelist and a historian. He's received the Daughters of the American Revolution's History Award for his book, Band of Giants. And he has contributed to national periodicals, including American Heritage Magazine, and is the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow. He has appeared on the History Channel and C-SPAN and been interviewed on National Public Radio. He grew up in a town near the Erie Canal and now lives in New York, in the Hudson Valley here. And you have a new book coming out in January on Thomas Paine.
Right, Tom Paine's War.
Okay, in honor of the American Revolution. So anyway, without further ado, here's Mr. Jack Kelly.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to thank the Historical Society of Stanford. I think local history is becoming more and more important and is more and more popular all the time. I'm talking about the Erie Canal, not exactly local history, but in a way it is, because the Erie Canal would not have meant much if it ended at Albany. But in fact, it went to Albany so it could come down the Hudson River. So the Hudson River is really part of the Erie Canal system. And we all live along the Erie Canal to a certain extent. I actually grew up quite near the Erie Canal in upstate New York, or western New York. I know some people think this is upstate, but western New York. And I used to watch the barges go through the locks, and we lived quite near the town of Palmyra, New York. And anytime I would ride with my family through Palmyra, someone would invariably say, "That's where he found the golden tablets." And I didn't know what the golden tablets were. I didn't know who they were talking about. But it was very intriguing when you're a kid. Imagine you can go out in your backyard and dig down and just find gold. So I got interested in it, and I began to research it, and I did the book on it. My book is partly about the building of the canal, but it's also partly about what happened, the various movements and controversy that developed along the Erie Canal corridor after the canal was done. And one of the first things I found in my research was that I didn't know before was about the geography of the canal. All of the Great Lakes, except for Lake Ontario, are at the same elevation, 570 feet above sea level. So that Albany is at sea level. I think most people know the Hudson River is really an arm of the sea that goes up at sea level. So if you could connect Lake Erie with Albany by water, you would have access to the whole interior of the country. You could go all the way to Duluth or to where Chicago is today. And they did have steamboats when the canal was being built. So that was the enticing idea, that you could have access to this whole vast area in the interior of the country. And I'm going to talk later about the sort of religious visionaries that sprung up along the Erie Canal. But the idea for the canal itself was a vision on behalf of this guy, Jesse Hawley. And he was a flour broker in western New York. And he would buy wheat and have it ground into flour. And then wheat was cheap out there. It was better land than back in New England or in Hudson Valley even. And then he would ship it down to New York and to the markets in the east. But the problem was transportation. He had to put it on in barrels of flour on wagons. They could only carry so much. It was expensive. The horses had to eat. The horses had to rest. Wagons broke down. Uh, the Mohawk River was also a possibility, but that varied so much that in dry weather it wouldn't be navigable. So he spent so much money on transportation that he went broke. In those days, when you went broke, you went to debtor's prison. He was in for 20 months in debtor's prison. While he was there, he had this vision, and he saw an image of Niagara Falls and all the water that pours over Niagara Falls. And he thought, what if you just dug a ditch and channeled that water down across the state to Albany at the Hudson River? You would have a great transportation link between those two places. And he didn't know anything about canals. He read up on the subject, studied maps, learned as much as he could, pretty much traced out the actual route that it would later be of the canal. And he published all this in a series of essays in a newspaper that he published anonymously, and it set off a great interest in building this canal. And the champion of the canal was a guy named DeWitt Clinton, who was a New York politician. He had been mayor of New York City. He was later governor, and he had a lot of clout in the state. And he got going the idea of actually building the canal. They wanted the federal government to pay for it. They weren't able to achieve that. So it came down to New York State had to pay the whole cost of building the canal. And it was going to take a good portion of all the capital in the state would be the cost of building it. And some people said that the whole idea was the effusions of a maniac. They said it was totally ridiculous to build a canal into this remote wilderness, which is what Western New York was at the time. The longest canal in the country at that time was 27 miles long, and they were talking about a canal 350 miles long. But the New York State Legislature, which I always say they must have moved a lot faster then than they do now, in a few months decided to go for it. They passed the bill, and they broke ground on 4th of July in 1817. It was going to be an amazing, complex engineering project, and the problem was there were no engineers in America. So they hired magistrates, and they had the one advantage that they knew how to survey, because they would have to survey over land disputes and laying out plots. So a lot of it was just they learned as they went along, Yankee ingenuity. They started working on the canal. And I always like to compare it to the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is 48 miles long. The Erie Canal is 360 miles. The Panama Canal rises up 85 feet from sea level. The Erie Canal rises up more than 600 feet. And of course, the Panama Canal was built nearly a century later than the Erie Canal, at a time when they had steam shovels and railroads and dynamite. But for the Erie Canal, they had none of that. And it was largely built by hand, with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows and a lot of Irishmen. So why was the Erie Canal important? It was a great commercial success, which I think most people know, but it had a few other effects that you might not think of. First of all, it made New York City the great port of America. Before the Erie Canal, New York and New Orleans had been vying to become the major port of the country, and New Orleans had access to the interior of the country through the Mississippi River. But now with the canal, New York had this access along the canal and then all the Great Lakes. So New York did win out and became the biggest port in America. The country had in 1803 had bought the Louisiana Purchase, which vastly expanded the land out in the Midwest. A lot of people thought that that area was going to become, would break off from the United States. It was too remote, it was too hard to communicate, to get out there, and it would become a country of itself. But when the Erie Canal was finished, it sort of brought that together, made it easy to go out to the west and to come back and to have communication between them, and it really united the United States. Many of the people who traveled along the canal, went west on the canal, were New Englanders. And another group was immigrants. When they opened the canal along the entire length of it, they had a big celebration, and there was a flotilla that went down the canal from Buffalo all the way down. In fact, it was 200 years ago this month that they poured a barrel of water from Lake Erie into New York Harbor, the wetting of the waters, they called it. While they were coming down, they ran into a boat going the other direction, and they couldn't understand what the people were saying. And as it turned out, they were Norwegians. And these were the first Norwegian immigrants ever to come to America. And they were heading out to the Midwest. And they were followed by many other Scandinavians, Swedish and Norwegians and Danish, that went out to the upper Midwest, and still has that feel out there today of the heritage of the Scandinavians. All of that meant that the upper Midwest was being settled by either New Englanders or immigrants who were either had no interest in slavery, or they were actively opposed to slavery. That blocked the immigration of people up from the Mississippi River, who had already started to settle in like southern Indiana and southern Illinois. That they were called butternuts, who wanted to establish slavery throughout the whole country. So by blocking that influx of Southerners into the upper Midwest, it changed the dynamic of the country, and they stopped talking about the settled East and the frontier West, and they started talking about the free North and the slave South. And this is 30 years before the Civil War. Another thing that I should mention, I didn't include in my book, but I've been alerted to since then, and it really is worth a mention, is that the Erie Canal was not a great thing for everybody. And the Iroquois, who are now go under the name of the Haudenosaunee, they'd already been largely pushed out of Western New York, but that was their home territory of all Western New York, was Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Seneca. But the Erie Canal really solidified their displacement, and was a great tragedy for them. Another thing that plays into the rise of what I'm going to talk about in a minute is the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution that had been passed fairly recently before that. In order to guarantee freedom of religion, they said there will be no more established religion. And the established religions at that time was, you had to pay taxes. The taxes were given to whatever the local church was, the established church, Congregational, Presbyterian, whatever it was. It didn't matter if you were a member of the church or not, you had to pay your taxes and went to support that church. And they said that was no more, not going to be allowed anymore. So it opened up a kind of free market in religion. And this was exactly the time when the Second Great Awakening was called. It was a great revival of interest in religion, and this open market in religion led to a lot of do-it-yourself religions, because anybody that could attract adherents could establish a religion. And the first one of those that I'm going to talk about, it may be a little surprising to people, is the Shakers. They were one of the earliest kind of do-it-yourself religions. They were founded up near what's now the Albany Airport by Mother Ann Lee, who came over from England, and she'd been a member of the Shaking Quakers. And she started her own cult up there, got adherents to follow her. And we all tend to know two things about the Shakers. They made very elegant furniture, and they were celibate. And in fact, they were one of the most radical of all the groups. They completely turned away from the world at a time when consumer culture was just beginning to get going. People could order factory-made furniture from New York and have it shipped up along the Erie Canal to their home, or they could eat oysters, inland, because they could ship them up fast enough they wouldn't spoil. They turned away from all that, and they, instead of having a Shaker church in every town, they had these large settlements where they would all gather together. And they were communists. They held all their property in common, and they were the beginning of a very long tradition in America of communal cults and sects and movements of various kinds that went all the way down to the 1960s. And one of the visitors said, yes, they held all their property in common. He said, what they did about their toothbrushes, I didn't presume to ask. Frederick Engels, who with Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, actually pointed to the Shakers as proof that communism works. He left out the whole religious aspect, which was sort of a big flaw in his argument, but that was what he thought. They believed that the end of the world was approaching. The official name of the Shakers was the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. And they would work hard all week, and they, on Sunday nights, they would have services in which they would dance, and the men and women would dance together, but they would never touch. And they would start singing hymns that would occur to them. They would start to tremble, and that's where they got the name Shakers. They would actually, some of them fall down in trances, and they would invite non-Shakers to come and watch this. They set up bleachers, and some of the people that were not Shakers were appalled. Others thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen, but a few would say, well, yeah, that looks like something I'd be interested in getting involved in. They had a great deal of influence on many of the other religious movements that came up along the Erie Canal. One of them being a group that was headed by a man named William Miller. Miller was from very far eastern New York State, up almost on the Vermont border, and he was a farmer, and he was a skeptic. He didn't really believe in religion, but he decided to read the Bible and see if it made sense to him. And he said, I'm going to read the Bible without any commentary. I'm just going to make my own judgments about everything. So he's reading the Bible, and he kept coming across numbers in the Bible. So many years, number of years, the number of cubits, the number of whatever ages of people, the time, 7 of this and 77 of that. And he started doing mathematical calculations on these numbers. And every time, he would always subtract, divide, multiply. It would come out to 1,843. So he made the logical conclusion, came to the logical conclusion that the world was going to end in 1843. And this is about 1830 when he came to this conclusion. So he started preaching that, said, you better repent because you only got so many years left. And he eventually he gathered a few believers, and then he hooked up with a guy named Joshua Himes, who was a kind of a religious promoter, and they bought the largest circus tent in America, huge circus tent. And they would go down the Erie Canal and stop at the towns and have revivals. And Miller would get up and explain. He had charts and all the math worked out for him. And it's hard to argue with mathematics. It's like, there it is. And they began to gather more members. And then they got to 1843. And days went by, the months went by, and they got to end of December, and Miller said, well, thank God, God has given us the tarrying time. He said, it's not going to end this year. We've got this time now. Nobody knows when it's going to end, but it's going to be soon. That got even more people interested. And Himes said, you should tell them what the date is, because that'll really encourage people to repent. So Miller was a little reluctant to actually tell the date, but he said, okay, it's going to be October 22nd, 1844 at midnight. And then it became somewhat of a frenzy of people joining up this movement. The churches divided. Some of the people in the church, because he said the church is no longer valid. The devil is now in control of all churches. You have to come out of your church. You have to join this movement. And there were churches that actually split in half. Half of them went with Miller and half of them didn't believe in it. It was a sign of faith to give away your home, to give away your farm, to give away your business, because you didn't need it. You didn't need to plant crops. There wasn't going to be a harvest. People actually did it. They put a sign up on a business, say, take what you want. I'm on my way to eternity. So the frenzy built up. They got to October 22nd, and what they were expecting to happen was not metaphorical. It was not a spiritual thing. It was actual. The corpses of people who had died, who were saved, would come burrowing up out of the ground and fly into the air. The people who were still alive, who were saved, would fly into the air. Jesus would come in all his glory, and then for the people who were left behind that didn't join up, fire would rain down on them and destroy them. So that was what was actually going to happen. And so people got gathered in homes. Some of them went to public places. Some of them went up, groups of them would go up on hills so they could be closer when they flew up in the air. And the clock is ticking. And we think New Year's Eve is a big deal. And then it got to midnight. And then it got to later and later. And then the sun came up. And they referred to that as the Great Disappointment. I think I would have called it the Great Relief, but they thought it was a disappointment. And the Miller movement then pretty much collapsed. A lot of people went back to the church and repented their repentance or something. And there was a woman up in Maine who gathered up the Millerites who still believed that it was end of the world, and she had an explanation of how the world had ended, but it was a spiritual ending, and they were now going to wait for their actual ending to come along. And she collected a lot of the Millerite people who still believed and formed a religion of her own, and that was the Seventh-day Adventist. And they're still going today, and there's still a legacy of William Miller. Many of the towns up along the Erie Canal, if you ever go up there and do some sightseeing, you run into a lot of towns that are called port, that have the word port in them. There's Fairport, Brockport, Lockport, Spencerport, Weedsport. There's even a place called Gasport. And in some ways, these were seaports. Cargo would come in, go along on barges along the canal with the rather rowdy crowd of guys that ran the barge business. And they had amenities for these people, and a lot of the itinerants coming through of bars to begin with, but also brothels and gambling joints, and there was a lot of fighting. And the worst of it was in Rochester. Rochester was the biggest city that the canal went through. So they got the idea that the city fathers thought that they needed a revival of religion. And they got hold of a guy named Charles Grandison Finney, who was the biggest revival preacher of that time, at a time when religion made headlines almost every day in papers, the different religious aspects of religious news. And Finney was like Billy Graham, the Billy Graham of his day, except he was much bigger than Billy Graham, much well known. And he actually invented many of the techniques of Billy Graham, of the way a revival meeting and all the other revival preachers operated. He came up with this. And what he did was to take the enthusiasm and the energy of the camp meeting, which they had these camp meetings out on the frontier, and they get a dozen preachers, and they all be preaching, trying to get adherents to their particular branch of religion that they were pushing. And people would come for miles around. They had to stay overnight because they had to camp out, essentially, so they got that name. And those were pretty wild. They were, people would go in to have fits, and they'd fall down, and the preacher would say, bark Satan up a tree, and then they all get down on their hands and knees and start barking up a tree. And that would attract other people, and they'd say, what's going on over there? Until this frenzy would get together, and they would support one preacher or another. He took all that and toned it down to a certain extent, but with a lot of the same enthusiasm, so that it could be accepted in churches. And he went around to actual churches and did the revivals. When he came into a city like Rochester, he would preach in every church, and then whoever he got converted would sign up with whichever the churches they wanted, but that he was sort of not interdenominational, you might say. He's still quite controversial. A lot of New England preachers who were very highly trained, they'd go through many years of training in divinity schools, thought that Finney was too, they said, if they're instantaneous, they were saved and this so quickly, they would just fall back, backslide just as quickly. But Finney he wanted everybody to be saved. And he had been a lawyer. He didn't have a lot of training as a minister, and he was a great talker, and he had eyes that were like the eyes of God, and he would point to somebody in the congregation and say, "Jeff Brouws, you are a sinner. If you die, you're going to go straight to hell for all eternity." And of course, Jeff is not a sinner. He's a saint, I guess you'd have to say. And come on down to the front. They had what they call the anxious bench. And then when there was pressure and you'd come and sit on the anxious bench, everybody would be praying for you to get saved. And a lot of people did get saved. And he saved thousands of people in Rochester. He started out with the rich people, because he figured if the rich people get saved, then everybody's it's going to become trendy to get saved. And that spread from Rochester. He was in Rochester for 6 months during the winter. The canal closes down in the winter. So he would preach every night, went door to door during the day. And this was really the culmination of the Second Great Awakening, and it established evangelical Christianity as one of the major religious forces in America. In some ways, we still live in the afterglow of Finney's Great Revival because evangelical religion is still very popular. The one difference is that in his day, evangelical faith was seen as liberal, or what we would now say was liberal. They were opposed to slavery. They were for more rights for women and more, attention given to the poor. In modern days, it's the evangelicals are considered more conservative. The last one I'm going to talk about, and the greatest of all the do-it-yourself religions, was formed by a man named Joseph Smith, Jr. He was born in 1805 up in Vermont. His family was kind of hard luck. I was recently just up in Vermont, and I was talking to somebody who's lived near where his family's farm was. They actually lost their money, they lost their farm actually, because they had invested in ginseng. And ginseng grew wild in the woods up in Vermont, and it was not used much here, but in China it was considered a real luxury. So they went into debt to collect all this ginseng, preserved it by boiling it in sugar, sort of like ginger, put it in barrels, sent it to China, thinking they were now going to get rich, and they got rooked out of their money. And so they had gone into debt, they couldn't pay their debts, and they lost their farm. That was a huge step downward for anybody then, because then you had to rent a farm, you had to work half the year just to pay your rent, and they were kind of a hard luck family, and it got so bad that they had decided to move out to Western New York, hoping there'd be more opportunity there, and they went to Palmyra just before the canal came through. But the land was already pretty expensive. They bought 100 acres on a mortgage, and they had to work to clear land in those days. It's quite impressive, actually, when you think about taking a forest, an old growth forest, cutting down every tree and planting a crop there. And sometimes they didn't cut the trees, they would girdle them and they would just die off. They would burn all the limbs for potash, and then they have to plant their crop. Meanwhile, since they didn't have a crop the first year, and since they had to pay their mortgage, they had to work in town for other farmers. So the whole family they had quite a big family, and they all had to contribute to try to get by. One of Joseph's ways of making money was to lead treasure hunts. And he was kind of like a dowser who can find water under the ground. He would go out and he would get a group of guys and they pay him something. They would go out at night and he would tell them where to dig for treasure, and they usually didn't find anything. And a lot of times he would say, well, you didn't dig fast enough. As you were digging, the treasure was going down farther and you didn't dig fast enough. They would drink. It was kind of a spoof in a way. It's like dreaming of winning a lottery. They thought, well, we're going to get some treasure. Occasionally they found some Indian burial sites. So when he was 22, Joseph Smith had a vision of an angel appeared to him and told him, there is gold, and it's up on Hill Cumorah, which was right near his house. And he went up there and he dug it up, and he found this golden plates, I guess would be more description of them. They were actually in a 3-ring binder, which was unusual, but that's the way he described it. And they were covered with hieroglyphics. So he brought them back, and he didn't understand how, what hieroglyphics meant, but he translated them through Revelation. And he had a secretary, first his wife, and then a secretary that became one of his devotees, who would write down what he said. And he dictated a book that was the Book of Mormon. And it was the story of America from his point of view, of how it was populated, of what America's role was going to be in the heavenly plan. He said the Garden of Eden had been in Missouri, and there'd been these various wars from different factions he described, and some of them ended up being the Indians. And the book is 600 pages long, 300 characters, stories within stories, flashbacks, prayers, sermons, all mixed in together. He dictated it. It was written down, went right to the printer. He didn't go back and make any changes in it. They printed the book. It was one of the most remarkable achievements of the 19th century. It was, whether you consider a book of inspiration or what he said was revelation, it was an unbelievable achievement for someone who had very little education and came up with this whole thing out of his head. But he didn't stop there. Once he got the Book of Mormon, he formed a church around it. And he began to get adherents to this church. And they very soon moved from Palmyra out to Ohio. They wanted to go out west. He was aiming to go out west. And they kept getting more and more people gathered together. And finally they did get to Missouri. They didn't get a very warm welcome in Missouri. So they went back to Illinois and they formed a settlement there, very much like the Shakers. Everybody was going to come to this one settlement. And it was called Nauvoo. It became the second largest city in Illinois. Like the Shakers, they believed the end of the world was approaching. And Smith formed the whole hierarchy of the church and the bishops, and there were all different orders of bureaucrats and priests, and every man was a priest in the religion, but you could also become a bishop, and essentially shaped the entire Mormon religion. And he kept having more revelations, and one of them being that you shouldn't drink coffee. His wife, they used to hang out and drink coffee and spit on the floor. His wife didn't like it, so he had a revelation that you shouldn't drink coffee, and Mormons have not drank coffee since then. One of the things he read in the Bible was that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So he thought that sounded like a pretty good deal for his religion. And he said, not only are we now going to be polygamous, but you have to be if you want to reach the highest level in the church. A lot of these people were pretty conservative, and they were happily married. Did they want to go out and get another wife? Quite a few of them didn't, and they objected to that revelation. And they formed another sect within Nauvoo, within the Mormon church. They were Mormons, but they were non-polygamy Mormons, or what they called, Smith called it plural marriage. But this is basically the same thing. And they started putting out a newspaper and trying to attract people to their point of view. And he didn't like that, so he had a squad of tough guys go over and break up the printing press that they were running. And he'd forgotten, or he didn't take it seriously, that he was living in Illinois, and Illinois had laws about things like that. And so he was arrested. and Joseph Smith was put in a jail just outside of Nauvoo, and some non-Mormons who hated Mormons broke in to the jail and lynched him. And he died in 1844. He was 39 years old. It had only been 14 years from the time he found the golden plates till the time he died, and he'd formed this whole religion and the Book of Mormon and everything else. And the religion certainly has endured. It's still growing. Joseph Smith never got to Utah. It was Brigham Young, who has also lived along the Erie Canal, that led the Mormons out to Utah. And today there's 16 million adherents to this very uniquely American religion. And it's also featured in a Broadway musical that started in 2011 and is on its way to becoming the longest running Broadway musical of all time, and has already taken in $800 million. So I mentioned before the Erie Canal was a great commercial success. It was actually too small. That one of the problems with it was that it was only 4 feet deep. So they immediately began to several decade-long effort to expand the canal. And it was making money even after the railroads began to compete with it. In 1 year, at the height of the canal, it took in more money than the entire cost of constructing it. So it was that successful just in the tolls. They eventually got rid of the tolls, but for a while they charged tolls. Actually, and I'll say this for some of the railroad people who have a railroad interest in the room, that the first passenger railroad was actually an adjunct to the Erie Canal, and it went from Albany to Schenectady. And there's quite a steep rise from the Hudson River up to Schenectady, and there were a lot of locks, so it was very slow going up all those locks. And if you took this little railroad, the first locomotive to pull passengers in America on that railroad in 1831, you could cut out a whole day of travel, which people did travel along westward on a canal. But the barges that I saw when I was a kid were really the end of an era. And beside the railroad, beside trucking, the main death knell for this Erie Canal as a commercial waterway was the St. Lawrence Seaway. And that allowed, they put dams and locks in the St. Lawrence River so that ocean-going ships could come up into Lake Ontario. And from Lake Ontario, they can go into the Welland Canal, which is a ship canal. It's vastly larger than the Erie Canal in its dimensions. That takes them over to Lake Erie, and then they can go on to all the rest of the Great Lakes. So the barges are so much smaller than an ocean-going ship that it was no longer feasible. There's a few things that still travel on the Erie Canal. The windmill blades, they sometimes ship on the canal. They send a huge brewing vat up to Genesee Brewery in Rochester on a barge. But most of the commercial, it's mostly now it's for pleasure, a lot of pleasure boats, and a lot of the communities along the Erie Canal have developed the canal front as an amenity. They have bars and restaurants along there. You can sit along the water. And but in 1900, the canal was still viable, and they had to decide. They knew it needed to be modernized, and they had to decide whether to modernize it. And the state decided to spend a lot of money. They spent, I think, like $100 million to. They eliminated the whole eastern part of the canal and turned the Mohawk River into a canal. If you go along the Mohawk River now, you see there's dams. They have locks beside them, and they control the level of water in the Mohawk. and then the western part of the canal went along the same route as the original Erie Canal, with modernized electric doors for the locks and so forth. And one of the things that changed then was that they no longer used mules. The original canal was subject to leaking. It was actually just packed with clay. So if you had a steamboat with a propeller or paddles, it would stir up the water so much it would exacerbate the leaks. So they put the power on land, and the power was usually mules and sometimes horses. So they would pull on a long rope and pull the canal boat down. Now that they got the new canal, they were able to use tugboats and power barges. They didn't need the mules, and so they got rid of them. And in 1905, a man named Thomas Allen wrote a song that many of us learned in the third grade that was, even then, was a nostalgic song. It was looking back to the time when the mules were still in the canal, and it was a simpler time, I think, that he felt. And I would say was that simpler time that we all remember when we were kids. That was the golden age, because America was different then. It was a time when you always knew your neighbor and you always knew your pal. At least you did if you travel on the Erie Canal. So that's my story.